every culture, every major culture on the planet records a flood legend. I say everyone except two. Egypt and Japan do not record a flood legend. Virtually every other country does. Every other culture does. From Alaska to Patagonia, China, India, Siberia, everywhere. But if you haven't looked, you wouldn't know it. Velikovsky looked. He knew it. The record is there. The first event that occurred that he found the evidence for was the close passage of the planet Venus in about 1500 BC. There had been other floods and deluges before that. And we heard quite a lot about the end of the Ice Age. That is a slightly different deluge when you get melting ice. This global warming nonsense is all about, oh, the ice caps will melt and we'll all drown. No, it doesn't work that way. There's a very simplistic view of ice caps don't melt. By the way, talking of glaciers, as I was, anybody know how many glaciers there are in the world? 160,000. How many of them are melting? All of them. That's what glaciers do. They melt. How many of them are extending? About half. How many of them are decreasing? About half. There's one on top of Kilimanjaro that's actually disappeared. Why has it disappeared? Well, how's a glacier formed in the first place? It's snow, frozen rain. Where does the rain come from? It's evaporation of, in the case of Kilimanjaro, the rainforest around it. Go up by heat, come down as snow. But it cut the rainforest down. No rain, no snow. Glacier gone. Simple. There's no basic problem with the science of glaciers. If you like a good book by a good author, which will explain virtually all of the global warming business, State of Fear by Michael Crichton. He's the guy who wrote ER, Jurassic Park. He knows his stuff. It's a thriller, but it's a good book. So when glaciers melt, yes, they produce a lot of water, but you have to have the conditions for them to melt in. What was happening as the planet Venus comes by, it doesn't just affect the oceans, it affects the mantle, it affects the liquid core of the Earth as well. Hence you get the volcanic eruption. The Deccan Flats in India may not have been created by that. The Deccan Flats are 250,000 square miles of volcanic rock on the north-central part of India, several thousand feet thick. It came from inside the Earth. We hear about Atlantis, we hear about Lemuria that disappeared, but nobody can find the evidence for it, so it can't be real. Well, how recently did the Himalayas move up? How recently did the Andes, were they created? We're told they're quite recent. There are there's fossils that have been taken off the top of Himalayas which show it was once under the sea because there are marine animals around that were in the rocks which are now 5 miles up. So what you have is a large planetary body. We'll call it the planet Venus. It could be the planet Mars. That came a bit later because the solar system has not always been the stable clockwork image that we have today. We know where the planets are, we know what they do, they're all in their place, they all do their thing. They haven't always been that. They haven't always done that. The ancient astronomers knew that. Now, those of you who were here yesterday and we were on the panel, I said, what was the difference between astronomy and astrology? And there is a major difference between the two. Both are vital. Astronomers study the heavens, the stars. Astrologers identify the influence of the planets. Why should this be? Why should the influence of the planets be of importance to us? So important that to be an astrologer in years past was a noble calling. It still is today. But the influence of the planets on Earth originated because they weren't always in the position they're in now, and it was necessary to identify that if they're going to move, what effect will that have on us? So if the planet Venus, which has not always been recorded as the fifth of the visible planets, there are 5 visible planets now: Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn. The Babylonians actually only record 4. They don't record Venus as being visible, so it was somewhere else. It's only recently that Venus has settled into the orbit that we know it's in today, relatively close to Earth, a relative distance away from Earth, as has Mars. Mars hasn't always been in the orbit that it is. This was some of the things that Velikovsky was saying. So you could imagine, I mean, even discussing them now in the 21st century, they're a little bit startling. You could imagine what effect they had back in the 1950s. That's why he was vilified, ignored, and basically his name was erased from history. I consider it is necessary now that he is reevaluated, because those who are familiar with the work that he's done and the books that he's written are grateful for the groundbreaking work that he did. And this is a scholar, this is a scientist who devoted his life to this work. He died in 1979 in America, and his final book was published 2 years after his death. He'd written it beforehand, and it was called Mankind in Amnesia. Now, Mankind in Amnesia, does that ring a bell? Have you heard that phrase before? Graham Hancock refers to it in his book, Fingerprints of the Gods. He says, humans are like a race with amnesia, like we've forgotten our past. Okay, I don't know if there are any psychologists here, so if what I'm going to explain isn't quite right, you'll no doubt correct me in due course. If you, as an individual, experience a devastating, life-threatening event, a terrible car crash, something very violent that is seriously going to damage you, you think you're about to die and you don't, you will go through what we call today extreme trauma. You can be counseled, people will get through it, but you will tend not to remember. You will tend to blank it out. It's too painful. The memory of what you've experienced is so painful. In order to get on with your life, you prefer to leave it in the past where it was. Supposing, as I mentioned earlier, the human race experienced a trauma of such devastation that it was virtually wiped out. There are a lot of records to indicate that the human race only just survived several of these extinctions. We talk about wildlife extinction and how we're going to lose the lesser spotted butterfly of some description or some other animal. And it's not a pleasant thing to believe that a creature that shares our planet may well be extinct as a result of our own actions. But if the human race was threatened with extinction, and 90, maybe 95% of the people alive were suddenly not alive, that means that just the front row in this auditorium survived and everybody else gone. The front row is going to be, what on earth happened? What do I do now? And we've had an interesting example of the worst thing that can happen when there's a flood. There's no drinking water. It's all contaminated. Yes, it would be. If the sea came in over the planet, if there were electric arcs going on, if there were such devastating events going on, hurricanes, huge events covering the planet Earth, and the front row here survived, all 10 of you, you would wonder, what do I do next? You might not even survive yourself, because if you can't find drinking water within about 48 hours, you are dead. That's how close it comes. What Velikovsky identified was that the man had experienced a trauma of such devastation that amnesia was the only way he could survive. It's the way a lot of people do survive. What you get are flashes. You get shadows on your memory, flashbacks. Oh. Something triggers the memory. What was that? And then you try to relive it. You know that you have to try and remember. Because it was devastation, the way we relive that demonstration is through warfare, through violence. It's almost a natural response that humans have. It's not a natural response, because overriding that is one factor which keeps coming back. It's referred to by many different names: the Golden Age, Utopia, the Elysian Fields, Xanadu, Lost Horizon. They're all flashes of what happened before, the civilization that existed before mankind was virtually wiped out. Yes, there was a golden age. Maybe we're here in this room because collectively we are familiar with the idea that this could have been, and that say, well, is there anybody who can tell me how to get there? Where is it? What do I have to do? Because that appears to many people to be a far greater ambition, a far greater belief than what we have at the moment. We look around at what we have today, the ridiculous performance that we see going on internationally and politically. And we say, no, it wasn't always like that. It was different. It was better. There was a time when mankind actually progressed, were good to each other, liked each other, wanted to work together. Why can't we have it again? We can. We just have to take the advice of any half-decent psychologist and say, well, how do you get mankind through the trauma of virtual extinction? So if there are any volunteers, we'll have a word later. The final point, how are we doing time-wise? 2 minutes. Thank you. Was the redating of Egyptian history. Velikovsky made some rather startling points about Egyptian history, which of course upset all the Egyptologists, as you can imagine. They're very easily upset, by the way. You won't necessarily be able to read this. It's quite an important one. I do have copies of this on the Nexus stand. And no, you don't have to buy a copy of Nexus as well. We'll give you that. There's about 40 or 50. Conventional chronology, revised chronology, and biblical history. You're comparing the three areas. The revised chronology is what Velikovsky claimed was more likely to have happened. It's quite technical, it's quite detailed, it's absolutely fascinating. Egyptian chronology is based on something called Sothic dating, which I will not go into, but it's based on a complete fallacy. The whole of Egyptian chronology is wrong. Simple. 18th, 19th dynasty, it's the one everybody's heard of. Tutmosis, 3rd and 4th, Hatshepsut. Those who've been to Egypt will have seen Hatshepsut's temple. They lived 500 years later than Egyptologists will tell you. And the reason is the Sothic dating is completely wrong. Dating it from a known event in history, this is the Exodus in 1450. We know that various people here, Solomon, David, existed. And the key point is Tutankhamun. We all know about Tutankhamun. Died in about 1320 BC, we're told. Absolutely wrong, completely idiots who believed that he died in 1320, Howard Carter included. But he didn't know any better, because they hadn't invented carbon-14 dating. In 1971, that's how long it took to get a piece of papyrus from Tutankhamun's tomb carbon dated accurately. The carbon date given for a piece of papyrus taken from Tutankhamun's tomb, which had not been disturbed until Howard Carter went in 1922, the date given was 840 BC, 500 years later than he's supposed to have lived there, 1350. Tutankhamun, 840. Sheila's not going to let me have time to explain about the Queen of Sheba, but the Queen of Sheba was an Egyptian pharaoh who went to visit Solomon. It's all recorded in Egyptian history and in biblical history. So anybody who tells you that that idiot talking about Egyptian history down in Glastonbury that day at the end of July 2007 doesn't know what he's talking about, just challenge them to come up with a better explanation.